Hello, thanks for inviting me to speak at the 20th edition of the Days of Civil Economy, which focuses on the very important role of the third pillar in the post-COVID era. In the standard view of liberal society, free and competitive markets, as well as a government to enforce contracts and protect property rights, are really the only two pillars that are needed. But as many in the audience know, this view, which was the dominant view in much of the debates of the 20th century, neglects the very important third pillar, which is the community and various community organizations, which both directly and through democracy make the markets and the state work for the many. And when it does that, the many support the system. To some extent, the malaise in the system, the dissatisfaction in the system, I will argue, is because the community has weakened relative to the market and the government or the state, and has therefore left a gap which needs to be filled if we are to be satisfied with liberal society again. Let me explain. First, I argued that the fundamental force affecting markets and governments has been technology. The information and communications technology revolution has changed markets tremendously. For one, we know it has facilitated trade. Global supply chains are now possible with manufacturing done across the globe, in part because the cost of transportation has been reduced by technology, but also in part because the cost of keeping touch with production in a faraway site in Thailand or Hong Kong has been reduced tremendously. We can keep in contact on a minute-by-minute basis. What this has done in industrial countries, of course, is it has hit manufacturing hubs, especially small towns with a large manufacturer who, when they close down and send work elsewhere, has left that little town with no economic activity whatsoever. But this is not just about small towns. In fact, the whole middle income layer of jobs has been seriously affected, partly by the outsourcing that has taken place as a result of globalization, but also because of the automation that has taken place. So for example, the tax accountant who used to do your taxes is replaced by a piece of software which you can download for a fraction of the cost, and you can do your own taxes today. Not only that, a number of professions, while a number of professions have gone down, a number of other professions have really come up significantly because of their ability to access worldwide markets. My own profession, that of university professor, is one example of a profession which has increasingly become a kind of superstar profession, where a few professors who can speak to the entire world through their writing, through their publishing, through their speaking, actually generate much larger incomes than the average professor because they have access to much larger markets. So to some extent, the information and technology revolution has, on the one hand, resulted in a whole lot of jobs disappearing, especially jobs in the middle, but it's also widened the gap between really good jobs, that can benefit from globalization and from the broad markets that they have access to, and jobs that have actually reduced in value as a result of the increasing automation and competition from elsewhere. The ICT revolution has also changed the states. As markets have become more integrated, governance powers have migrated up because the bigger the market, the higher the governance has to be in order to apply to the entire market. Take one example, which is bank capital requirements. It used to be that we had community banks and bank capital requirements were set locally. All bank regulation was local. Then banks moved into the national economy and bank regulation became national. Today, banks are international. And so where are most of the bank regulations set? Typically, they're set in Basel behind closed doors where the central bankers come together and talk. And then those regulations are taken and applied to the rest of the world. So in that sense, bank regulation has migrated up and up from the local to the national to the supranational. And this is true of many kinds of activity which where the powers have typically tended to migrate up. The European Union is one example when in an attempt to maintain homogeneity across the union, many rules are not set at the national level, let alone the local level, but they set in Brussels at the European Union level. As a result of both these factors, plus the globalization and automation I talked about earlier, the ICT revolution has disrupted the community. Because first, there's economic activity which leaves the community. And as the economic activity leaves the community, social disintegration sets in. Marriages start breaking down. There are more divorces. As a result, there's more substance abuse, alcoholism, drug problems, and then there is crime. All this tends to weaken local institutions such as schools and colleges, and that's particularly problematic in this era because technological change has increased the importance of good schooling. And when you have local schools breaking down because local jobs are no longer there, you have a disruption in the process of taking advantage of these stronger, bigger markets. In fact, what happens in the community is that it tends to lose even its own people. The successful tend to leave the community and go where other successful people are, to the big flourishing cities away from the local community, leaving the local community even less capable of dealing with the big changes that are happening. So the community has weakened because it has been hit harder. It has been disempowered. We talked about how governance has been taken out from local to national to international, but it's also disintegrating because what holds the community together are good jobs, good local institutions, and those are breaking down because economic activity is moving away. What all this points to is that if we are to have a change for the better, we need to focus on improving the quality of every place. It can't be that we focus on things like the GDP of the country, because the GDP of the country and its growth is not something which says a lot about each and every community. Each and every community experiences that growth very differently. And there are, in a prosperous country, very many communities which are falling far behind. The pandemic has accentuated every one of the fault lines I've talked about. For example, I've talked about the fact that education is very important. In this world, having higher skills is very important to be able to compete for the jobs that there are. But in fact, those jobs are the jobs that you can continue doing during the pandemic. Many people who do high valued service jobs have been able to sit at home, just like I'm doing now, and do their jobs because they can do it at a distance. On the other hand, many people who are doing the low value service jobs or the low value manufacturing jobs have been in the front line experiencing the brunt of the coronavirus pandemic. Now, even in response, we have seen that centralized solutions simply don't work. My country, India, as well as Mexico, had very brutal centralized lockdowns. Peru had another brutal centralized lockdown. And these tended to completely demolish economic activity. Peru has suffered a fall in GDP in the second quarter of 27%. India had 23%. These are huge falls for relatively poor countries. And there's a lot of resentment in the country because people are saying, why did we need to be locked down when in fact the problem was in the big cities? Now, countries that have been much more sensitive to the local, countries like Germany, countries like South Korea, have managed to do far better in combating the virus. Moreover, what we see during the pandemic is the local community has been critical in filling the holes. In some communities, the younger people didn't want the elderly to go out and perhaps get infected. And so they used to do their grocery, their shopping, provide services for them, sometimes even do their laundry in order to keep them relatively safe. And these were people, young people who didn't know the elderly, but knew that they had a responsibility as part of the community. In India, migrants from the big cities started going back to their villages, and many people along the way helped them just out of humanity. In a number of communities, it's community people rather than the police who are disciplining neighbors who have stopped social distancing and trying to convince them that social distancing is important to deal with the virus. And in many places, it is the community which has been the safety net of last resort. When the government doesn't provide people sustenance, it's the community that's come together to provide food banks, to provide clothing for those who don't have support from the government or the market. So what am I arguing we should do? Well, I would argue that post-coronavirus, we have a chance to remake society. And I would say we want to have globalization. We want to have the benefit of international markets, international trade, international investment. That makes all of us wealthier. If we stop that, then we start creating lower growth, lower benefits for everyone. But we need that globalization while making everybody benefit from it. And I would argue there are a number of ways where we can help more people benefit without substantially diminishing the value of globalization. One, for example, is to push power back from the international to the local. What I'm arguing for is let's not pull power up into the international arena in the way we have done. We need fewer global treaties on business environment, on intellectual property. Much more needs to be decided country by country. And I call this responsible sovereignty. But even within a country, power should not be held at the capital. It should follow the principle of subsidiarity and push power more to the local. Power should be held at the level which is most capable of, in fact, executing that power. So for example, in Switzerland, when it looks at education, the central national institutes of technology are funded, managed at the federal level. However, the high schools are managed and funded at the canton level, and there are 26 cantons. And the primary schools are managed and funded at the municipality level, and there are 3,000 municipalities. Each level of education is taken care of by a different level of government, so that at that level of government, people have a greater sense of responsibility, a greater sense of action. So one is we need to push power down. The second is economic activity has to be spread. And the good news from the coronavirus pandemic is that is possible. We now know many jobs can be done at home, far away from the place of work. In fact, 45% of jobs in rich countries like Scandinavia or the United States can be done from home, according to work by colleagues of mine. So if that is the case, why can't they be done in communities across the country so that those communities don't get, may get deindustrialized, but they don't lose economic activity? There are still people working in them, doing jobs. Perhaps the job is in the big city, but the work can be done remotely. Similarly, technology allows small manufacturers access to both national and international markets, even if they are in a niche business. So for example, there's an Amish family in Ohio. Amish are people who don't live in the 20th or 21st century. They still, depend on horses for all the farm labor. And this Amish family has built a flourishing business selling high-tech horse-drawn farm equipment. And they use the latest technology to manufacture the equipment, but it is basically horses which run the equipment. And the question is, this is a really niche business. Who else buys it? Well, it turns out it is bought by Amish families across the United States. And the fact that this business can advertise on the internet allows it to access all those families. And in fact, this business has drawn on technologies developed in Europe by similar companies which are catering to Europeans who want to live with a lifestyle which is not in the modern age. So what I'm arguing for is, if we can push bars down, if we can spread economic activity down, we can get more of a sense of localism. And I would argue that that localism is in fact needed to save globalization and cooperation. Now, whenever I talk about localism, people immediately say, well, there are lots of broken communities which don't have the leadership to create local activity. And in many ways, broken communities, of which every country has a number, these broken communities have really, they face the problem of development. And I have looked at a number of these communities. It turns out that there are ways they can pick themselves up. Often it requires community leadership, and that leadership can emerge more quickly if in fact there are people who are engaged, who have jobs, who have moved back to their communities after doing college, and we need to encourage more of this to happen. That community leadership can engage the community, and there are different ways communities can be engaged, sometimes in cleaning up, sometimes in fighting crime, sometimes in just coming together in a community activity, such as a community garden. What is important in many communities is infrastructure, whether it's broadband to connect them to the digital economy, or transport to connect them to the places of work. And then, thinking through this carefully so the communities engaged in structuring these is very important. And of course, communities cannot flourish without funding. Poor communities don't have the funding to pull themselves up, but given some initial seed money by the center, they can figure out what to spend on. The spending should be decided locally, but if it is decided locally, it can actually bootstrap a recovery which can be quite strong. So bottom line, I'm arguing for localism, which is walls around the community to give a sense of identity and empowerment of that localism. Even if nothing changes, this gives people a sense that they can deal with faceless globalization and technological change. It gives them a sense of engagement. That itself is very important. It may also, the community may also be where the jobs of the future lie. For example, helping the elderly cope with loneliness. That is a community job. It can be created within the community. It is probably a job that robots or somebody sitting far away in the Philippines cannot do. But I think localism itself is not enough. It has to be inclusive. So even though the community erects low walls around it, the state and the markets should keep the walls low and not become high walls. We don't want enclosed communities that don't interact with the world. That is going back to the Middle Ages and before. So the market needs to be able to traverse the community to bring it into the modern world. But the state also should be able to work with the community, also enforce laws against discrimination in the community. Now, this seems like a contradiction. On the one hand, I want small walls. On the one hand, I want walls. On the other hand, I want those walls to be low. But this is possible. In country after country, we've figured out ways to do it. For example, in the United States, there's the Commerce Clause in the US Constitution, which essentially says that states have the power to decide what they will do within the states. However, they cannot erect walls against goods coming from other states. You can't have a state-specific tariff in the United States. That's the Commerce Clause. I think ideas like this will allow us to create communities that are strong, that are inclusive, and that in fact prepare our people for the world of globalization. Let me stop there. Thank you very much for inviting me again.